While not the best reviewed by critics, The Lost World Jurassic Park was one of the fan-favorite films in the franchise, including some of the best scenes to date in any Jurassic media. While I acknowledge the first film is definitely a better movie overall, the second one holds a very dear place in my heart, and it's my favorite of the entire franchise. This second film was created based off another of Michael Crichton's novels. The second novel was unplanned, but after the success of the first film, Crichton made another at the request of Steven Spielberg. Despite Spielberg's request, the film is strikingly different from its novel counterpart. One of the consistencies between the two is that the second film and novel both focus on Ian Malcolm as the main character. The reason for this being is that Malcolm was a fan-favorite character in the first film, no doubt thanks to Jeff Goldblum's stellar performance. Aside from that though, the plot, the characters, and of course, the dinosaurs are all very different from one another. The Lost World takes place on Isla Sorna, a different island from the first film. This island served as sort of a factory where they would make most of the dinosaurs and raise them for a time before transferring them to the main park on Isla Nublar. Crichton reveals in The Lost World that the labs on Isla Nublar were mostly for show, with a very minimal amount of animals being made there. Both the film and the novel have quite an abundance of dinosaurs, however, of course, some don't appear in one or the other. And once again, we'll do our best to go in order of when we meet the animals, but that's not exactly going to be consistent, as we meet them at different times in both the film and the novel. However, if you're here only for large carnivores, those appear at the end of the video. But for now, starting us off, we're going to take a look at the first dinosaur introduced in the film, Compsognathus. The Compies are a very underrated threat in this film, and no one takes them seriously until someone is killed by them. On their own, these diminutive creatures aren't incredibly dangerous, but they're almost never alone. In both the novel and film, these animals look fairly similar to one another, except the novel versions are always striped. On top of that, the novel's animals are also pro-Compsognathus instead of Compsognathus. They are two completely separate species, but I covered this in the last video, so go check that out if you want more details. In the novels, the Compies are venomous, a trait that was originally thought to have been omitted from the films. However, Camp Cretaceous later acknowledges that Compies do in fact have venom in the films. In fact, Camp Cretaceous shows us how the venom works in the films and gives us our first Compy kill since the second movie. The venom they use in the film causes numbness and a loss of feeling in the afflicted body parts. However, many folks argue against this, that it's still not enough evidence because we see Dieter Stark bitten several times and he doesn't seem to have any ill effects. Regardless if Stark showed any effects, Camp Cretaceous is considered canon, so the Compies are in fact venomous, whether they show it or not in the film. Compies appear 3 times in the film. First, they appear on the beach of Isla Sorna, where a rich family happens to be vacationing humans, but not necessarily more than they do for other predators. The animals that do have a fear of human have learned this habit because humans tend to treat them unfavorably, which can lead to aggression or fear. And I think Burke said it pretty well, they had no reason to fear man. The next time we see them in the novel, it is because they're following the Parasaurolophus and eating their dung. They do so to gain nutrients that the larger dinosaurs leave behind and don't use, kind of like a recycling system. Richard Levine, a character exclusive to the novel, observed that they were only eating the fresh dung, which led him to try and collect a sample. During this process, a Compy bites Levine on the ear, and while he doesn't show any adverse effects, he does claim to be mildly affected by its venom. The final time that we see the Compies in the novel are when Dogson encounters them. And before you ask, yes, that Dogson. In the novel, Dogson and his crew are attempting to steal dinosaur eggs for Biosyn, and in their attempt to steal the Tyrannosaur eggs, their car was thrown into a tree and Dogson fell out and got knocked unconscious. When he eventually woke up, he was surrounded by Compies, and they were eating parts of him, though he couldn't exactly feel it at the time. Their venom had made him more and more sleepy, extending his period of unconsciousness. He only awoke because it felt like someone was tugging on his fingers, which of course the Compies were. He found that they had eaten parts of his fingers, as well as small pieces from him all over the body. Despite the venom making him sick, they understandably did not capture this dinosaur because they had no means to transport it. Momenchisaurus would get its chance along with other dinosaurs to shine in later Jurassic content, being in Jurassic World Evolution and its sequel. There are 2 minor issues with the sauropod in the film. Its neck is slightly too short and lays at more of an angle than it should. It is technically also slightly larger, but that's not too unreasonable. With all that in mind, I'll give this animal a 7 out of 10. Instead of Momenchisaurus, the novel once again gives us Apatosaurus as the main sauropod. While we don't get an exact number, the main herd is stated to be rather large, and they mainly live within the valley. While the Apatosaurus design in the novel is definitely a bit dated, even today it's still fairly accurate. With that in mind, the Apatosaurus on the island somehow re-evolved the ability to breathe, implying that frog DNA wasn't the only factor in the first novel. Several species, including the Tyrannosaurus and the Apatosaurus, didn't have the rana or frog DNA from the first novel and weren't breeding on Nublar, but now they are somehow able to reproduce on Isla Sorna. Unfortunately, we never really get an explanation for this plot hole, so we just kinda have to roll with it. The Apatosaurus in the valley lived alongside a herd of Parasaurolophus, and the animals had a mutually beneficial relationship. The parasaurs would serve as a sort of alarm call or early warning system, as they had better eyesight than the sauropods and could alert them to the presence of predators. You'd assume a massive sauropod had nothing to worry about, but with the way Jurassic Park animals act and with 2 full-grown T-Rexes on the island, you can never be too safe. Another thing sauropods had to worry about from the predators on the island was a disease known as DX. We will get more into the disease a little bit later, but essentially it can cause even a healthy animal to start dying. This disease can take an incredibly long time to show up, but it only takes a single bite from an infected predator to transfer this disease and eventually kill the sauropod. While I'm doubtful that the Apatosaurus were aware of the disease at all, they would still defend themselves alongside the hadrosaurs. They're mostly a background animal in the novel, but we do learn what happens to those that do end up getting bitten and infected by predators. Because of their life in the valley, most of them end up dying in the water after being afflicted with the disease, and their body is eventually pushed downriver. Most of the Apatosaurus carcasses are deposited at a bend in the river, where the raptors happen to make a nest. But we're getting a little off track now, so the Apatosaurus gets an 8 out of 10, just like the first time. Another victim of InGen's dinosaur safari is Pachycephalosaurus, specifically one that Roland nicknames Friar Tuck due to its bald appearance and his inability to name the creature. The Pachycephalosaurus seen during this scene is at first surrounded by a group of hunters with devices to capture it. The individual was noted not to be fully grown. And honestly, what we see on screen isn't really all that bad and is fairly accurate even by today's standards, so because of that, I'll give these guys an 8 out of 10. Pachycephalosaurus is also in the novel, and we see them quite a few different times. The first time we see them is when the group is examining the valley up in the high hide. Malcolm and Levine give a rather basic description of the animal because not much was known about it during this time. Because of that, we're going to kind of assume that these animals looked very similar to the films, except they have a dark green coloration. Their behavior in the novel is often compared to them being bipedal versions of the African buffalo, grazing seemingly peacefully until they're disturbed. The animals in the novel are incredibly aggressive, and whether this is because of the virus or not is unknown, because again, when the novel came out, not much was known about Pachycephalosaurus. Despite all that, the size of the animals isn't far off, as Malcolm and Levine give a range of sizes, but only about height, at around 4 to 6 feet or 1.2 to 1.8 meters. After this first scene, we don't see the Packies again until Howard King, one of Dogson's associates, encounters them while driving down one of the roads in an attempt to get back to where his boat is docked. However, a herd of over a dozen Packies blocked the road, causing him to try to push through slowly. He attempted to rev the engine to spook them, but as he tried to do that, instead of moving, they became aggressive. The Packies attacked him in the vehicle, and when it became clear that he couldn't just push through, he attempted to get out of the vehicle, which caused them to attack once again. The Packies damaged the vehicle slightly and almost hit Howard a few times, but eventually King gets off the road and leaves the Packies behind. The final time we see the Packies is near the end of the novel in the exact same location. Harding, having discovered the vehicle, wanted to take it to get to the helicopter in time for the group to leave. Sarah claims that she found over 50 Packies surrounding the vehicle, and she attempted to climb a tree and a branch that hung over the vehicle to get into it. However, one of the Packies headbutts her tree and she falls directly next to them. However, she rolls under the car and the Packies attempt to get her, but to no avail. They began stomping around the car, but ultimately there was nothing they could do short of working together to push it off of her. However, they don't do that, and eventually all the Packies retreat, leaving Sarah under the car as Dogson and one of the Tyrannosaurs shows up. Because both of these animals were designed with roughly the same information, I'll give them the same score, an 8 out of 10. Back to the film, we are introduced to Parasaurolophus once again in The Lost World, but it appears differently than it did in the first film, something that would become far more common in the Jurassic franchise going forward. Most of the films seem to have different designs for Parasaurolophus, and why this is done isn't exactly clear. These Parasaurolophus in the film are mostly tan in color, with red tinges around their crest and their neck and a pale stripe going down one side. In the original film, this stripe is barely visible, but in later Jurassic media, the stripe would become much more prominent. These parasaurs are once again smaller than their real-life counterparts, oddly about the same proposed size as Stegosaurus, reaching about 33 feet or 10 meters and weighing around 4 tons. However, the Lost World film was the first time that this hadrosaur got more than destroy the hunters' camp, including their communication equipment as well as their vehicles, as they aren't seen again for the remainder of the film. The design of the Triceratops in the Lost World is very similar to the one from Jurassic Park, albeit it's a slightly larger size. Because of the more accurate large size, I'll give this Triceratops an 8 out of 10. As for the novel, the scene of the Stegosaurus crossing in front of the group is replaced with Triceratops instead, and it's kind of funny to me how these animals swap roles constantly throughout both pieces of media. Their passing is witnessed by Eddie, Ian, and a man known as Doc Thorne. Thorne is sort of the dad of the group, though it seems his character was removed from the film entirely. Regardless, the three witness the herd of animals, and it leads them to the valley that they will spend most of the book in. Later, we see the Triceratops where they were peacefully drinking by the river, but the peace doesn't last long. The herd begins to get agitated and make high-pitched noises described to be similar to a yelping dog. With their backs to the water, they form a class of defensive circle as seen in many different types of dinosaur media. The accuracy of this is pretty questionable, but it happens regardless, and they form a half ring around the youngest member. They do this because nearby they can hear and sense raptors. Triceratops is thought to be a mostly solitary animal, and this is actually acknowledged in the novel. Crichton was aware he was challenging the known theories, and it was done on purpose mostly for entertainment reasons. The valley possessed incredibly tall grass, very similar to the film, except this grass was more of a tan and beige color, similar to a savanna. A single raptor allowed itself to be seen, getting the attention of the herd and causing them to focus all of their attention on it as the other raptors approached, concealed in the long grass, showing off their intelligence once again. However, a storm began, and a lightning strike revealed some of the raptors. Because of this, the Triceratops managed to find the other raptors, forcing them to move on. However, even as the raptors began to retreat and the Triceratops began to calm down, one individual raptor who was still nearby attempted to attack the baby Triceratops. Despite the raptor being faster than the Triceratops, the adult was still close enough and managed to protect the baby, but not before being slashed in the snout by the raptor's claw. The raptors realize they're outmatched, and they quickly retreat and slink back into the woods to try to find another opportunity. The last time we see Triceratops, it's in the same place. They are still by the river in the valley as King appears after escaping the Pachycephalosaurs. King's arrival spooks the herd because it causes the raptors to become active again. Fortunately for the Triceratops, the raptors aren't focused on them, and instead they focus on King. Unfortunately, I'm gonna have to knock a point off from these guys, giving them a 7 out of 10 because that defensive behavior likely wouldn't have happened in real life. A few different dinosaurs and prehistoric animals appear very briefly and aren't seen for the rest of the film or novel, but some of them do appear in later Jurassic media. Pteranodon is a great example of this. While absent from a majority of the movie, a pteranodon shows up at the end, landing on a branch for the closing shot of the film. This toothless pterosaur was actually the most accurate the Jurassic series would ever get for a pteranodon, as future versions had far more wrong with them. This design, though it only appears for a brief moment, was one of the best in the film, but because we get a full body shot, I'll give this one an 8 out of 10. In the novel, this includes animals like Mussaurus, a small sauropodomorph who appears when Richard Levine first arrives on Isla Sorna. The novel actually does fairly well describing the animal, however, it seems to imply that this individual is an adult and not a baby. Mussaurus would have been quadrupedal in its younger stages and would have shifted to a bipedal stance as it aged. The animal that Levine encounters is capable of walking on its hind legs and is described as shades of green and brown. However, this is the only time we see the animal in the novel as it quickly gets scared and retreats as Levine is attacked, and I'll give these guys a 7 out of 10. While they only appear for 2 scenes of the novel, we also get to see Maiasaura. We get a brief scene describing their nesting habits on the island where they're all together in a communal nesting site. This scene goes into detail about the findings of Jack Horner in Montana at the famous Egg Mountain site. Maiasaura is one of the first dinosaurs we discovered to have complex parental behavior, and it's exhibited pretty well in the novel. The animals built their nests together for community protection, covering their eggs with old vegetation, which provides enough heat for the eggs as the big animals would crush them otherwise. Unfortunately, the Maiasaura are disturbed by Dodgson & Company as they use a box to create a high-frequency sound which drives the Maiasaura away from their nests. After driving them off the nest, Dodgson and his group proceed to steal the eggs, the whole reason they came to the island. You'll find out how that goes for them a little bit later. We see the Maiasaura one more time as they come to reclaim the young after they've hatched from Dodgson's theft earlier. The Maiasaura are described the same way as the first novel, large, beige hadrosaurs with flat snouts like the older depictions of the animals. They've got the same rating as before, a 6 out of 10. The final creature that we see very briefly only appears as a corpse, and we never get a really good description of it as Levine finds it just before it's destroyed. The animal is described as being roughly the size of a horse with hairless, pebbled skin. It was green with darker stripes running along its body, and he noted that it had a small forelimbs so it couldn't walk on its front limbs. The animal had spikes running along its back and seemed to have been killed by some kind of wound, likely from another predator. He also found a tag on this dinosaur, showing that it had encountered and been tagged by humans before. Levine later claims this animal as Ornitholestes, but we never get confirmation on that, and as that's not 100% identifiable, I'm not going to give this guy a rating. Before we get to our last two animals, the novel once again introduces us to a horrifying and monstrous version of a creature we already know and love. This is none other than the infamous Carnotaurus. As you might expect, these abelisaurs had short snouts similar to a bulldog, but with arms that would make a T-Rex confident. The novel Carnotaurus are slightly smaller than their real-life counterparts, being around 7 feet or just over 2.1 meters tall. While we don't get a length measurement, estimating based on that height, we can assume a length of around 20 to 25 feet or 6 to 7.5 meters. Yet despite not being the largest predator on the island, they were likely the most feared animal on the island, at least during nighttime or in the thick jungle. But why? Well, to put it simply, because like John Cena, you can't see them. Many animals today are capable of blending in with their environment, including reptiles like snakes and lizards due to their skin pigmentation based on their environment. Other animals, like the octopus, take camouflage to an even more extreme degree, which not only they change color but also texture, which gives them some of the most advanced camouflage on Earth. These Carnotaurus land somewhere in the middle. The Carnotaurus are able to shift their skin pigments to match their surroundings, but only in low light or dark areas. Bright lights hitting their bodies can expose them, but beyond that, they are almost invisible. They are even capable of mimicking complex patterns like a fence and its surrounding plants and blending in with that. During this time, they are almost completely invisible, but in the same way a predator or an elite from Halo is invisible, albeit the Carnotaurus is slightly better. Thorne notes that if you really pay attention and focus, you can see the slight ripple of their camouflage as they begin to walk. In the novel, the main group enters a location known as the Worker Village, and it seems this is a part of their territory during the nighttime. Immediately upon the group's arrival, the velociraptors fled, and earlier in the novel, the Tyrannosaurs had left the territory as soon as they could and hadn't stopped once inside. Because of this, Levi noted that all of the animals feared Carnotaurus during the nighttime, even the Tyrannosaurus. During the day, these predators hunted in the thicker jungles of Isla Sorna, where they would have a harder time being seen in the daylight and avoid the open area of the Worker Village. These predators only appear at two portions of the novel, the first time being in the thick jungle during the day when Levine first arrives. Levine had arrived on the island with a local guide from Costa Rica named Diego. While Levine was holding the Mosasaurus upon his arrival to the island, it suddenly hissed and dashed away from him. Levine realizes why too little too late as he smells the foul odor of a carnivore. Levine is forced to watch in horror as Diego is attacked and dragged off into the woods, but because of their camouflage, he doesn't see the animal that attacks him, but he does briefly glimpse a dark green foot. Levine only survived this encounter thanks to his backpack, which was ripped off him in the attack, allowing him to flee. We encounter them again later when Doc Thorne is attempting to get gas for the vehicle that they managed to steal from Dodgson. Here, it's only through Harding's quick thinking that they're able to rescue him. Thorne had been inside of a shed checking for gasoline when the Carnotaurus found him in the shed, and he barely managed to make out their silhouettes in the moonlight. Cornered and with nowhere to run, Thorne hid behind some of the oil barrels trying to come up with a solution. Meanwhile, back at the store, Levine mentioned that the Carnotaurus have a refractory period, a portion of time where their camouflage takes effect and their skin changes. They only discover this after they initially discover the Carnotaurus when they accidentally switch on the lights in the store. The island still has power due to relying on geothermal gas for its energy, and Sarah uses this to turn the lights on and off with the help of Levine. The sudden change of light causes the Carnotaurus to continually try and shift their color to accommodate that light, trying to blend in as best they can. After doing this for a little while, Levine and Sarah take flashlights and go outside and start running the flashlight's light over the body of the Carnotaurus. Because of the Carnotaurus' inability to hide itself and causing themselves to be exposed, they decide to flee rather than fight, as it was unknown to them how dangerous the humans were. As for accuracy, we all know it's not a very accurate animal, but it's a very fun animal, and it's gotta be a terrifying creature that makes Tyrannosaurus Rex afraid. Unfortunately, I've gotta give him a 3 out of 10, because while they got the basic body plan right, a lot of this was incredibly far-fetched. Much like the first film, Tyrannosaurus Rex is one of the main attractions of both the book and the film. As opposed to the first film, where Rexy serves as a sort of secondary antagonist as well as an anti-hero in the end, they're elevated to the main antagonist in the second film. While they look mostly the same as the original Tyrannosaurus, these guys are notably striped with tiger-like patterns on their face and back. The male is a green color with a paler underbelly, while the female is seen as a brown or tan color. Before we even see them on screen, Tyrannosaurus is built up throughout the first parts of the movie. Early on in the movie, Roland makes it clear that he wishes to hunt a male, a buck in his own words. This would lead to the nickname the buck and the doe for the film's main pair. After this, Roland and Burke, the same paleontologist from before, discover a set of tyrannosaur footprints after the dinosaur safari. Roland takes his friend Ajay with him as the pair set off in search of them. Eventually, they discover a descent back to Isla Sorna, this time with a military escort in an attempt to prevent another San Diego incident. The last time we see the Rexes in the film, it's as a reunited family. The Tyrannosaur design never changes until the Jurassic World films, so just like before, I'll give these guys a 7 out of 10. Just like the film, the Tyrannosaurs in the novel are a pair-bonded male and female. They are both very similar in appearance, though it is said that the female is slightly larger than the male. They are about the same size as the adult Rex in the first novel, standing 6 meters or 20 feet tall with a length of 42 feet or just under 13 meters. Also like the first novel, these Rexes are a rusty red color and their skin is said to be extremely leathery. Just like in the film, we also see baby Tyrannosaurs, but more than one in the novel. The pair had created a tall mud mound nest, and she laid 6 eggs. By the start of the novel, 2 of the eggs have hatched, and by the end, a third joins them. The infants are covered in a coat of downy feathers, the same color as their parents' scales, except for a ring of white down around their neck. This is probably one of the best spots of accuracy in the second novel, as we assume today that Tyrannosaurus Rex had a light coat of feathers as a baby and shed these feathers as they age. I also have to give Crichton some points for retconning his own ridiculous theory. While I'm unsure why he did it, Crichton went out of his way to make clear that Tyrannosaurus Rex could see you fine, whether you were moving or not. One character who's exclusively in the novel, George Basilton, found this out the hard way. Basilton had been misled by Grant and another fictional paleontologist named John Roxton. Fun little side note, John Roxton is actually the name of a character from the original Lost World by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Both Grant and Roxton claimed that Tyrannosaurs couldn't see you if you didn't move, and Grant based his experience off the first novel's encounter and said that the rain may have also had a part in confusing the animal. The first time we see the Rex in the novel is when Kelly and another character not in the film named Arby are hiding from the others and stowing away on the trailers like she did in the film. A Tyrannosaur finds the trailers but doesn't attack or anything, even though it's thought that it does see Arby. We see the same Tyrannosaur, thought to be the male, right after this when it encounters Thorn, Eddie, and Malcolm during their initial exploration of the island. Its scent marks their car but doesn't attack them as it continues to bring the carcass it's carrying back to its nest. We see them again when Thorn attempts to rescue Levine, as Levine was alone on the island and attempting to study the Tyrannosaurs. Thorn finds Levine in a tree at the Rex nest where he summarily falls out, alerting the adults to their presence. They zoom out and are chased out of the nest on their motorcycle. Once they're far enough away, the Rexes give up the chase. We don't see the Tyrannosaurs again until Dodgson, Basilton, and King attempt to steal their eggs like they did with the Maiasaura. Once again, they use a box that emits an ear-piercing shriek to drive the Tyrannosaurs off the nest. After forcing the Tyrannosaurs a comfortable distance away, King goes into the nest and steals one of the eggs, but breaks one of the baby's legs in the process. The infant's cries of pain make the Tyrannosaur adults visibly upset, and it makes Basilton panic. Despite Dodgson yelling at him, Basilton refuses to enter the nest due to his own fear. Dodgson then attempts to grab the second egg himself, but in the process he accidentally unplugs his box. Earlier in the novel, Basilton had informed them about Roxton and Grant's claims that the Tyrannosaur couldn't see you if you didn't move. Unaware that they've been misled, the two immediately freeze after the box stops emitting its sound as the female approaches and sniffs Basilton. It doesn't take long for the men to realize the Tyrannosaurs can in fact see them, and as they begin to try to run, Basilton is brutally killed by the mother. Dodgson bolts back to the Jeep where King is already waiting, and the pair attempt to escape. The pair of Rexes cut off Dogson's escape from both ends, forcing them to drive the vehicle off-road. The novel doesn't make it clear what happens to the egg they stole, so I'd assume it was smashed in the car crash. While that was going on, Malcolm and the others attempted to assess the damage that Dodgson had done. They discover the missing egg and the injured infant, and this time it's Levine who warns that the parents won't be gone long. They tell Eddie to kill the baby, as with a broken leg it will likely not survive long anyways, and it'd be better than letting it suffer. However, unbeknownst to anybody else, Eddie saved the infant instead and brought it back with him to the trailers. Eddie is an incredibly pure soul in the novels, and he's the younger engineer with the group. In the films, Eddie's character is mixed with Doc Thorne, but in the novel, he's an apprentice and student of Thorne, and only in his 20s. The man had a big heart, and he couldn't bear to leave the injured animal there when he knew they had the material to help it back at the trailers. However, the material that he brought with him was polymer resin, which he intended to make the cast out of. However, this was an incredibly strong material and would stunt the infant's leg if it wasn't removed. So this created a slight engineering problem in the novel, where the cast that they would make would have to be strong enough to help the baby heal, but frail enough to break off naturally as it grew. To quote the novel exactly, they solved the issue by making a cast that is strong for vertical stress but weak against lateral stress. They end up making a cast out of aluminum foil coated with the aforementioned resin. This makes the foil harder but weak enough that it'll fall apart as the animal grows. A pretty neat little engineering feat in a novel about dinosaurs. However, just like the films, the Tyrannosaurs attempt to push the trailers over a cliff, and in the process, Malcolm's old leg injury from the first Jurassic Park is reopened and it cripples him for the remainder of the novel. After successfully pushing half the trailers off the cliff, Thorne arrives to try to help Malcolm and Harding and scares the Tyrannosaurs off with the bright lights of his vehicle. Believing Thorne to be a new threat to their infant, they gather their child and leave, allowing Thorne to rescue Harding and Malcolm. Half of the trailer still falls off of the cliff in the process, but half of it stays on top. We only see the Tyrannosaurs one more time in the novel. When Thorne went out to rescue Malcolm and Harding, his electric vehicle shorted out due to the heavy rain. He found Dogson's gas Jeep and used that instead until the following morning when the Maiasaura destroyed it. Because of this, the vehicle was abandoned until the following day when Harding was sent to look for and reboot it. Dogson had managed to tune into their radio chatter during this time, and after learning that there was a car, he attempted to take it for himself. As I mentioned earlier, Harding was underneath the vehicle thanks to the Pachycephalosaurus. She witnesses Dogson attempt to steal their car before she kicks his feet out from underneath him and causes him to fall over. After a rude conversation between the two, they both feel the vibrations of an approaching T-Rex, and Dogson squeezes himself underneath the car with her. Despite this, the Tyrannosaur either saw or smelled them as it attempted to move the car and get at the people underneath. Harding made a call. Harding was an incredibly strong woman, and she also had better leverage underneath the car, and she was able to use that to her advantage to shove Dogson out from underneath the car slowly. Despite his pleading, she succeeds, and he ends up getting carried off by the Rex, though he isn't killed or even wounded immediately. Instead, Dogson is carried back to the nest where he experiences the same fate as Ludlow from the films, though arguably worse. The adults attempt to encourage their babies to hunt and kill Dogson, and when Dogson attempts to escape, they pick him up and break his legs. Crippled, in shock, and with no defenses left but his arms, Dogson got the fate he deserved as the juveniles ate him alive. Because of the accuracy of the hatchlings, I'll bump up the novel's Tyrannosaurus score to an 8 out of 10. Once again, we reach arguably the main dinosaur of the Jurassic franchise, Velociraptor. While they were the main antagonists in the first film and novel, in the second, the raptors are more secondary villains in the film. Before we dive further into that, these raptors are notably different from their previous variations. Why this occurred is unknown, likely just for a new look to the animals. The pack on Isla Sorna that the group encounters are bright orange with dark orange and black stripes lining the top of its body. Personally, this is my favorite raptor design in the films, not because of accuracy or anything, just because I think it looks cool. We only encounter the raptors a single time in the film, just before Malcolm and the others leave the island. The first sequence is again one of the best in the movie, and we all know it as the long grass. Here is where most of the hunters' numbers are thinned out, as the pack seems to have a very high amount of members, and they began to systematically hunt the group, dragging them below. Just like before, I'll give the film's raptors a 2 out of 10. The novel raptors differ in quite a few ways from the film, but before we really get into that, let's talk about this mysterious DX disease that I keep mentioning. DX is a disease based on protein fragments called prions. Prion proteins can be found in people and animals and is not usually harmful. However, sometimes these proteins can become irregular, causing their structure to shift, change, and fold. This change messes with the normal functions of the cells and can cause several types of diseases, usually localized in the brain, as this is where most of our natural prion proteins can be found. The easiest way to transmit these types of diseases is through ingestion. Real-world examples of prion-related diseases are illnesses like mad cow disease, which humans can get from eating tainted beef. However, in humans, the illness is known as Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. DX is essentially the dinosaur variant of mad cow disease. This disease first occurred because the carnivores were fed ground-up sheep extract when they were infants. Malcolm and Harding say this is a mistake because ground sheep is more susceptible to diseases. However, I have found no source to back that up, so take it with a grain of salt. They also say that ground sheep is almost never used in places like zoos because of the same reason. So if I have any zookeepers who watch my channel, let me know in the comments. Is that actually a thing? Regardless of its authenticity, the carnivores on the island became infected with this DX disease. The disease seems to affect all the carnivores in different ways, with the Tyrannosaurs not showing any outward signs. However, as I mentioned earlier, prion-related diseases can often take upwards of 5 years to show any symptoms. For the raptors, the disease functions similar to mad cow disease and was apparent to people like Sarah from the moment she saw the raptors hunt, even though she wasn't entirely sure what was wrong. Animals infected with prion diseases are often far more aggressive and can often become nervous and violent in situations where they normally wouldn't be. This is where the term mad cow disease comes from. The raptors were the most obvious carriers of this plague and exhibited completely different behavior from the wild raptors on Isla Nublar. Despite looking near the same in outward appearance from the first novel, they behave more like the captive raptors from the first novel rather than the wild ones. The wild raptors on Isla Nublar were predators, to be sure, but they did not display extreme amounts of aggression, and they actually cared for their newborns. The captive raptors in the first novel killed a newborn without a second thought, and they kill indiscriminately, even if there was available food. Despite essentially being crazy raptors, these guys still work together and display enormous amounts of intelligence, especially when hunting animals like the Triceratops. After Sarah's arrival on the island, she witnesses a pack chasing down a Dinosaurs and immediately notes that there are too many raptors for a prey animal this size. Her curiosity gets the better of her and she tries to observe the animals at a distance, as this is what her work normally entails. She notes that normal feeding sites usually have a pecking order, with larger predators who made the kill going first and smaller predators around the outskirts waiting their turn. The large predators usually use this opportunity to feed their young. These raptors, however, she describes as to be in a feeding frenzy. They mobbed the carcass, only stopping to fight with one another over space or scraps, and one fight was bad enough that an adult was badly wounded on its side, forcing it to abandon the kill. This same animal would attempt to get back into the feeding, biting another adult to try to make more room for itself. However, this infuriated the other adult, who turned around and immediately gutted it. As this raptor lay dying, 3 of the other raptors left the original carcass and began eating their fallen comrade, some direct cannibalism. While all this was going on, a youngster who was only about half the size of the adults was constantly lingering on the edge of the kill. While it wasn't killed, the adults continually snapped at and drove it away from the carcass, and Harding noted that these adults didn't care for their younger members. We see the raptors again later, during their encounter with the Triceratops, which we already covered. However, as that opportunity closed for them, another opened as King, who was desperately trying to get back to his boat, entered the plains of the valley. King, who was still disoriented from his encounter with the Packies, started eating a candy bar as he tried to figure out his game plan. That candy bar will be important later. As he was walking through the plains, he suddenly heard a hissing sound and smelled a foul odor of a carnivore. This is essentially the novel's version of the long grass scene, as King attempts to escape from the raptors. 2 raptors immediately begin swimming across the river towards him, with others attempting to circle around and cut him off. King, understandably, began to run for it, and he immediately found another raptor directly in front of him with its head rising out of the tall grass. He swerved to avoid it, and another leapt at him and keeps running. King bolted for the tree line, but another raptor was trying to cut him off, but King looked like he was going to make it. Just as you begin to think King might make it, another raptor lands on his back and digs its claws into him. King has a moment of lucidity, similar to Hammond in the first novel, as he can count every single blade of grass in front of him before he dies. As I mentioned earlier, the raptors in this novel are absolute savages, and they immediately rip apart King's carcass, one going so far as to rip off his head. One of them found King's chocolate bar and delicately picked it up with its forearms. It tasted the chocolate before retreating from the pack and eating it alone. According to Levine, the animals seemed to be enjoying it. Later on, the group realized their mistake in setting up the high hide right next to a game trail. As night began to fall, the raptors followed said game trail after finishing with King's corpse, and they were wiping their faces with their arms as they approached, something Arby found disturbingly human. The high hide was pretty high in the air, so they managed to quiet down and hope to be missed as a group of 12 raptors passed underneath them. This is where that candy bar becomes important. Levine had been eating candy bars all day, and he was being a bad person by littering and tossing his candy wrappers onto the ground. Because of that, I'm blaming this whole situation on Levine, and that's not unfounded either. The raptor that had eaten King's candy bar discovered Levine's wrappers and soon discovered the hide. Immediately upon discovering the hide, the raptors begin to attack, leaping as high as they could and clanging against the structure. Levine noted that each time they jumped up, they were learning. They initially scramble for purchase, unable to find it and most of them falling over off of the hide. However, the longer they jumped, some of them began to figure out how to hook their claws into the metal and use their arms to pull their legs up. They began to successfully climb the high hide, and Eddie attempts to fight them off, at first with a flare and then with a metal bar. Meanwhile, Levine attempts to get the kids onto the roof of the structure before Eddie gets yanked off by a raptor grabbing his metal bar and pulling him out of the high hide. Unfortunately for Eddie's pure soul, all the raptors abandon the hide and immediately begin to attack and eat him. Eddie's death jarred Arby, and the young boy panics and ends up kicking Levine as he attempts to help him onto the roof. Because of this, Arby falls off of the hide and lands directly next to the raptors and Eddie's corpse. Thankfully for the kid, Thorn and Eddie had brought a smaller cage with them to the island. I don't exactly remember why, but Arby had no other option, so he entered the cage and locked himself inside. Unfortunately for Arby, the key was still in the lock, and as the raptors attempted to get at the boy inside, the key's elastic band got caught on one of their lower jaws. The raptor with the key panicked and bolted across the plains as the rest of the raptors took Eddie's corpse and the cage and began rolling it back to their nest. This kicks off a two-part chase, one with Sarah and Kelly chasing down the raptor with the key, and the other with Thorn and Levine chasing down the cage and Arby. Sarah and Kelly's chase is possibly one of the most thrilling moments in the novel, and it's one of my favorite parts. They chase the raptor out onto the plains, with Kelly using the rifle, the same kind Eddie uses in the film, and Sarah driving the motorcycle. Kelly, being a child and inexperienced with firearms, misses the first shot, and the bumpy ride makes her misfire a second shot as well. The raptor, knowing it's being followed, attempts to bolt for the river to try and swim away, and Kelly and Sarah try to cut it off. They crash for a moment, but they manage to get back up and on the motorcycle despite being covered in mud, and make it in time to cut the raptor off from the river, but it began to run straight for the Apatosaurus herd. Kelly, unfortunately, misses another shot, forcing Sarah and her to chase the raptor directly into the herd. The raptor. Kelly describes the ride through the sauropod herd like being in a living forest, and Sarah, being a badass, manages to get the bike right next to the raptor as they clear the herd, and Kelly gets a point-blank shot, which finally succeeds. Sarah, being a clever girl, double taps the raptor to make sure it's dead before she takes the key from its mouth. Meanwhile, Thorn and Levine discovered the raptor's nesting site, which was at a bend in the river where the Apatosaurus bodies would naturally float to after they die, forming a sort of graveyard. The raptors brought both Eddie and Arby back here and were in the process of fighting over Eddie's corpse when the duo arrived. At Malcolm's request, Levi noted that the nest was in complete disarray. As opposed to the neat organization of the nesting site in the first novel, this was utter chaos. These nests were poorly made and had been clearly stepped on and damaged, and there were scattered eggshells and tiny bones that Levine assumed to be the infants that never made it. Levine could only spot 3 juveniles out of the group, but he said that all of them looked undernourished. With 10 raptors in the clearing and only 6 shots left in their gun, the duo was unsure of how to get the kid back. Thorn, in his own words, decided to do it the old-fashioned way. With Levine driving and Thorn using the gun, the pair drove directly through the raptor nest towards the cage and Arby. Thorn is a pretty strong man, and he immediately leaps out of the Jeep, grabs the cage, and puts it in the vehicle as the pair begin to drive off just as the raptors attack them again. One of the raptors manages to sink its teeth and claws into the Jeep's canvas and hold on as they begin to drive off, instinctively bit down on the barrel of the gun. That, of course, signed the raptor's death warrant as Levine fired, but it took the gun with it as it fell out of the car. After that close call, Thorn takes over the driving as the other raptors begin to catch up, attempting to stop the vehicle. One even jumps directly onto the hood of the car before sliding off. Another bit the driver's side mirror before Thorn slammed the vehicle into a boulder, which caused the mirror and the raptor to be left behind. Another raptor lands directly on top of the Jeep's canvas, where Levine tries to stab it through said canvas before the raptor stabs him instead. As they manage to shake the roof raptor, another raptor leaps directly into the back of the Jeep next to him and the cage. Out of weapons and out of options, Levine thought that this was the end until all of a sudden Sarah and Kelly arrived, shooting the raptor and once again saving Levine. At this point, the Jeep was nearly out of gas, but Thorn managed to get the car over a hill and unknowingly into Carnotaurus territory, while Sarah and Kelly went back for Malcolm. The raptors refused to enter Carnotaurus territory, so instead they begin to chase the women again on the motorcycle. They chased the women all the way back to the remaining half of the trailer before Harding and Kelly got inside and slammed the door shut, locking it. Thankfully, Levine came in handy for once, as he had pre-stashed some nerve gas grenades that would induce paralysis in the island's animals for a few minutes, which Kelly and Sarah discovered. The grenades seemed to be a dud at first, but the raptors, being the curious little menaces that they are, bit directly into it, setting off the gas and paralyzing its entire group. The final time we see the raptors in the novel is at the very end, and they're the last dinosaurs we encounter in earnest. As daylight approached and the Carnotaurus camo would no longer work, the raptors lost their fear and entered the worker village. They found Levine and the others hiding in the shop here, which they proceeded to attack with everything they had. Thorn and Levine attempt to hold the door shut, others slamming into the walls or trying to break through the windows. They managed to put a fridge in front of the door, but they were still trapped. They were trapped until Kelly discovered a maintenance hatch underneath the store, big enough for a person to crawl through. The group manages to crawl through and escape as the raptors finally break into the store through the door and even some tearing down the walls, but once again, the humans were already gone. These raptors are arguably less accurate than the previous novels, but for the sake of continuity, we will give them the same score of a 4 out of 10. And there you have it, folks, the dinosaurs of the Lost World compared side by side to one another. What dinosaurs were your favorite? Did you like the book's animals or the movie's animals better? Let me know in the comments below. I'd like to thank you all so very much for watching, and it means the world to me to have such an amazing community, and I hope you guys all know how much I appreciate you. Remember to be good people, and I'll see you guys in the next one.